Biodiversity. When studying ecosystems, biologists often use the term biodiversity to describe the variety of plant and animal life that may exist in a particular area. Biodiversity is the total of all living organisms in an area such as a park, a lake or a province. In your area of Newfoundland and Labrador, this might include bears, wolves, spruce trees, trout, frogs, and eagles. It would not include elephants, tigers, crocodiles, or palm trees since these organisms are not normally found here. All living things on our planet are connected. No one thing can live in isolation from other living things. The plants use the sun, animals eat the plants and other animals die and worms and bacteria break them down so that new plants can make food using the sun. This has been the cycle of life for billions of years. In general, the more types of organisms present in an ecosystem, the more diverse it is. This means there are the greater available food sources that animals can use to meet their energy requirements. Food chains. A very diverse ecosystem will have a lot more food chains than a less diverse ecosystem. Food chains are a way of showing who eats whom in an ecosystem. For example, a spruce tree may get eaten by a deer who in turn gets eaten by a wolf. A single food chain illustrates only one part of what happens in an ecosystem. Consider the following simple food chain with 4 links or levels. Here we have plankton being eaten by capelin which get eaten by codfish. Of course, the codfish get eaten by the seals. Notice that the arrow points to the organism doing the eating. Food web. Most organisms have more than one food supply. For example, gulls eat crabs, mussels, prawn as well as whelks and limpets. Lobsters eat many different animals, such as crabs, mussels and whelks. Each individual organism is involved in many food chains. These food chains interconnect to form a relationship called a food web. A food web is the combination of all of the food chains which exist within a community. There are many food chains in an ecosystem and many species can be placed on the same levels. This is because they feed off the same prey as other organisms on that level. Thus, the more diverse the ecosystem, the greater the likelihood it will be able to sustain itself in the face of population changes. Competition. Competition between organisms exists in every ecosystem. Since living space and food are limited, organisms must compete among themselves and with other species for the necessities of life. Organisms are forced to compete against their own species and also different species in order to survive. The stronger and more fit organisms have an advantage over those who are weaker, and they have a better chance of surviving. How does competition arise? Competition arises when organisms have requirements in common and they must compete to meet their own needs. The more needs organisms have in common, the more intense the competition. When the resources that are being competed for become scarce, the competition becomes more intense, and eventually one of the species becomes eliminated. Competition among same species. Competition can occur between members of the same species. Many birds of the same species compete for the best nesting grounds. In cases when food or water is scarce, members of the same species will compete for food in order to survive. Competition among different species. Competition can also occur between members of different species. Different species often compete for space, food, or water. For example, the coyote and the lynx both compete for Arctic hares, rabbits, as a source of food. The majority of feeding relationships in an ecosystem are based on competition, food chains and food webs. Each species has a particular habitat and has a particular way of obtaining its own food. But when two different species overlap or interfere with one another, competition occurs. As the food supply becomes scarce, the competition becomes more intense. And eventually one species will starve and become eliminated from the ecosystem. Competition can also occur between members of the same species. And when worst comes to worst, those with the most helpful adaptations will survive and the less well.